Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of this course. I need to apologize for the lateness of this video. Apparently, the video that I put up earlier in the week didn't have the sound properly inserted, so I apologize for that. So I'm re-recording something right now on Thursday, and hopefully you can still have a narrated PowerPoint to help you think through all of these readings. So, anyways, uh, you've got papers due this week. They're going to be due Sunday by midnight. And my deal is if you can get me your paper by Friday, I will get it back to you by Saturday so that you can I will get it back to you by Saturday with a tentative grade. So I'll give you the comments of how I would grade it in its current status, and then you can still update it. A lot of you have gotten your papers to me already. I actually have three that I still need to do tentative grades for. I will get to those as soon as I upload this video. So, anyways, hope you guys are doing well. Columbus, we got a picture of Columbus here. So this is a statue of him in Lisbon, Portugal. That's why it's Cristóbal Colombo. And this is something that I know you all know a lot about. I know it's something you care about, something you have opinions about. And so let's get right into just how transformational Columbus's voyage was to the world. All right, so you've seen this slide before. Oh, where do I put my face? Let's put my face. I don't want to be covering this ship. All right, how about right there? Okay, so the slide you're looking at shows one of the reasons why Columbus made his journey to begin with. I showed you this slide at the very beginning of the semester. So, despite all the eruptions destroying the archaic trade system we started with, by 1492 the overall direction of trade was still much the same as it had been centuries earlier. Trade systems in the world as it existed before most people knew about the Americas were centered around the Middle East. The silks, porcelains, spices of Asia were hot commodities in Europe. The artwork, gold, people of Africa were desired in the Middle East, while the people of Eastern Europe, and I'm talking about slaves, wools, wines, honey, and furs, helped pay for things from the rest of the world coming from Europe. So, since all of this trade was centered on the Middle East and people were charged significant markups for the trade items they controlled, there was a huge desire on the part of Europeans to get around the essential monopoly that Middle Easterners held. So, everything that's being traded in the world is going through the Middle East. Global trade goes through the Middle East, which means the Middle East is insanely wealthy, and Europeans who are growing in power, growing in prestige, they want to figure out a way to get around this monopoly. And so that's what motivates voyages like Columbus. Especially spices. Spices by the 1400s were such a rage. They were viewed for their healthcare properties. People liked food to not taste like crap, and so many spices in the world come from India. So Columbus, even though he didn't find a route to India, insisted upon it for so long that we still call Native Americans Indians to this day. So the point of the next slide is just to emphasize that Columbus wasn't alone among explorers in this period. Uh, there were so many explorers, many of whom you've heard of before, others who you probably may not have heard of. So I'm skipping over the more commonly known explorers of the age of exploration to look at some lesser known people whose motivations were similar to those of Columbus, really to make the point that there's a period of global exploration frenzy. Yermak Timofeyevich on the left was a Cossack explorer. He was very briefly mentioned in the Sunderland reading I gave you a couple weeks ago, who got a contract with a Russian fur trading company to go explore Siberia. At the same time that English fur traders, Russia's best customers, were beginning to look towards North America instead of Russia. The Russians needed more trade goods to keep their European customers happy. So Timofeyevich made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And if you know anything about Siberia, it's cold there, so the animals have thick fur. He claimed it for Russia, of course, and succeeded in setting up what would be an infrastructure for Russia to become the biggest country in the world, really to compete with the explorers of North America. So over in China, 60 years before Columbus left on his journey, and Timofeyevich is, his exploration is a century after Columbus, but 60 years before Columbus, a man named Zhang He convinced the emperor to build a treasure fleet with ships that were more than 10 times as large as Columbus's to be able to set up trade relations with the Indian Ocean, the area where so many of the riches were. Zhang He made two voyages. On the second, he brought back a giraffe and paraded it through Beijing as a present for the emperor. Uh, there were Chinese people who thought that his voyages were really cool. They thought the giraffe was really cool. There were others who found it to be a colossal waste of money. Ultimately, the empire decided that such things were a waste of money, and they sunk Zhang He's ships to the bottom of the sea. His ships were, oftentimes more than 10 times as big as what Columbus would sail with. Excellent, excellent vessels. So I've had many students speculate that had China kept the ships, maybe they would have discovered the New World first. But ultimately, the Chinese decided that trade was a waste and that they should instead focus on their own production. And it was early Ming Dynasty China that built the version of the Great Wall of China we're all familiar with today. So these ideas they stick around, of course. I mean, we recently had a politician whose main campaign slogan was to build a wall and to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States to avoid, uh, the kinds of foreign trade. So these ideas they ebb and flow. Um, okay, so I want to spend a little time looking at areas of the world from which explorers didn't discover America. So it's a nice way to tie together the themes we've been covering so far in this class. So let's jump back to China. The Ming Dynasty arose in the 1300s in response to Mongol rule of China. So you've seen this slide I'm showing you before. Uh, I'm showing you again before too. It's about the Yuan Dynasty. So the Mongols who ruled the Yuan Dynasty were foreigners who arguably caused China and much of Asia to thrive through revitalizing ancient trade routes like the Road. But the Mongols had a hard time keeping control in the aftermath of the Black Plague. So, after a period of instability, when many Chinese people blamed the Mongols for their, misfortunes, for the misfortunes of the plague, the Ming Dynasty arose. So, and you haven't seen this slide before. So, in its early years, the Ming Dynasty was open to trade. It sponsored adventures like the amazing, incredible Zhang He that I just talked about, who was contemporaneous with European explorers like Henry the Navigator. But that changed, as I just mentioned. It wasn't just trade that they disdained, it was foreigners in general. China was incredibly xenophobic under the Ming Dynasty. They felt that they were the center of the world and that anyone else was a barbarian. So, despite their insularity, with time, the Ming grew tied into global trade more than ever before. Turns out that you can't avoid global trade, even if you build big walls and try to be completely insular. So, for the Ming Dynasty, silver coming from the New World across Asian and oceanic trade routes eventually devalued their currency to the point that they too became unstable. And after a period of instability in 1644, Manchus, a non Han Chinese ethnic group, established the Qing dynasty. So I want to jump to Russia now. Here, we'll put my face back in there with Boris Godunov. There's a good spot for me. All right. So we last dealt with Russia when covering the collapse of Kiev Rus with the murderous Mongol invasions of the 1230s and the 1240s. For the next almost 200 years, the Mongols ruled Russia by giving all governing privileges to local nobility called boyars, then provided the boyars, if the boyars would pay a steep yearly tribute. So it was a rather light governing strategy that empowered those Russians who could best negotiate with the Mongols each year to be in charge. Over the next 100 years, though, those Russians who cooperated with the Mongols to pay tribute began to mimic them. They even called themselves things like Hans. So by the 1300s, one Ivan I conquered Moscow, exacting tribute from people there in resistance to the Mongols. Over the next century, Moscow, rather than Kiev, became the new center of Russian power. They were the ones negotiating with the Mongols. In 1476, Ivan III would throw off Mongol control, famously tearing up their yearly demand for tribute, and he would unify Russian lands under his power. Over the next century, Russians struggled to establish a government that was something more than what the Mongols had. Yet, like the Mongols, they conquered across Asia and demanded yearly tribute from those they conquered, offering no services other than protection. So, so many empires in this period were really little more than like mafia protection rackets. Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Great, Grozny in Russian, it means both great and terrible, much like the word terrible used to imply greatness in English too. So Ivan the Terrible established many of the structures of Russia's monarchical power. To do this, though, involved intense brutality. One night, in a fit of rage, for example, he killed his own son, who was to be his heir, leaving only his mentally disabled son for the throne after his death. For 4 years after Ivan the Terrible died, a regent, Boris Godunov, right down there on the bottom with the fancy outfit, reigned in his stead. So when Godunov became Tsar in 1598, people in Russia rebelled, and Russia had a civil war for 12 years. During this period, the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth attempted to take the throne, but they failed. In 1612, Mikhail Romanov, who would become the Tsar, and the Romanovs would remain Tsars of Russia until 1917. So it was under the Romanovs that Russia established a rigid system of serfdom, ironically, at about the same time that places in Europe were giving up on serfdom. So that's a lot in 2 paragraphs, but I want to set this up for when we come back to Russia in more depth in a couple weeks. All right, let's move to another part of the world. My slides will let me click. All right, gunpowder empires. So, of the three regions of the world that I just covered, they all might be considered ruled by gunpowder empires, with the caveat that Russia and China aren't usually categorized as such. So, gunpowder empires are so called by historians because they monopolized the power structures needed to control gunpowder, which is a huge deal with 1400s level technology. And because they had gunpowder and their enemies didn't, they were very hard to resist. And these gunpowder empires became the new dominant powers in the world. They were governments that were based on powerful, expanding militaries, whose governing was left to loyal governors who owed their positions to the emperor. Eventually, the descendants of these governors would get comfortable in their regions and start to act independently of the center, thereby weakening the gunpowder empire in competition with tightly structured, well funded European states. Empires that were key in this period, though, of really emerging and controlling the world in the aftermath of the Black Plague, were the brief dominion of Tamerlane, its spin-off, the Mughal or Mughal Empire of India, the Safavids of Persia, and the Ottomans of the Middle East and southeastern Europe. So, fun little tidbit about the Mughals. The town of Delhi, New York, is named after Delhi, India, the capital of the Mughal Empire, and it was a joke. The person who wanted to name the town wanted to name it Mapleton in 1797, and his name was A- Erastus Root, and his arch enemy Ebenezer Foote. Instead, filled out the paperwork and called it Delhi to make fun of Erastus Root because his nickname was the Great Mogul because of his lavish lifestyle and heavy spending. So, in order to make fun of him, he named his town Delhi instead of Mapleton. So our town, Delhi, New York, is a 200-year-old joke by one person making fun of another. Okay, so let's see. So other empires, the Mughals, the Safavids, Persia, Ottoman Empire. We'll deal with these later in the semester. Okay, let's get going here. All right. This next slide is really just my way to illustrate what ultimately happened with the discovery of the Americas. The center of global trade shifted from the Middle East to the Atlantic Ocean. meaning the center of global wealth went from Middle Eastern empires and kingdoms to those Western European and eventually American countries that could dominate the trade of the Atlantic Ocean. That trade would eventually become criminally profitable through the use of slavery. We'll deal with slavery later in the semester, but for now I should mention that roughly 15 million people were sent across the Atlantic to the Americas. Probably 3 million died en route, and many more in the brutal plantation conditions of places like the Caribbean and eventually the American South as well. So, the other group that suffered from this shifting in global power from here to here were Native Americans. The best estimates developed over just the last 40 years are that roughly 95% of the population of the Western Hemisphere died within the first century of contact. The tens of millions of people who died, primarily from diseases to which they had no immunity, were rarely able to tell their stories. So much of what we know about pre 1492 Native Americans doesn't come from them because they weren't alive long enough to tell their stories. Uh, the plague, the Black Plague, was absolutely devastating to the Old World, where as high as 50% of some populations died. But when you get to the level of death that happened in America, entire societies and ways of life disappear. Once large civilizations became small, wandering bands of survivors. What's incredible is that so much of native culture survived the guns, germs, and steel of contact, as the author Jared Diamond titled his book 22 years ago. So, I want to go over with really broad brushstrokes uh, a few of the areas of the New World as understood from their own historical records, also as understood with those who descend from these cultures today, who identify with them, and from archaeological evidence. So I'll start with Mesoamerica. Broadly speaking, those pre-Columbian people in southern Mexico and Central America are referred to by archaeologists as Mesoamericans. It's Greek for Central Americans. They like the word because it sounds fancier. So, over thousands of years, people have lived in this area of the world, starting with the San Lorenzo civilization, which gets periodized later as the Olmec. They're the ones who carved the giant heads. Pretty cool. Um, Followed by the Mayans. So, and Mayans are, of course, still around today. There are lots of Mayan languages throughout southern Mexico and Central America. So by the time of the Mayans, they had developed the ability to have perhaps the highest population density in the world, with lots of excess production necessary to build fabulous monumental architecture, temples, cities, and even to develop two sophisticated writing systems. So one key of their civilization was the domestication of corn from a non-edible species called teosinte. So corn or maize and potatoes, another New World crop, produce more calories per acre today than any other terrestrial crop. You can get more with aquaculture, which the Mesoamericans also did. So these, of course, weren't the only Central Americans. A latecomer group were the Aztecs, and it's important to understand how unliked they were by Mayan speakers. The Aztecs were Uto-Aztecan speakers who came late to Central America. They developed a massive city at Tenochtitlan and took Mesoamerican practices of human sacrifice to a horrifying new level. So much so that on the next slide, you'll see that when a certain conquistador left Cuba to go find the famed City of Gold, he managed to topple the entire Aztec Empire by marshaling the regional hatred people had for the Aztecs. Traditional explanations emphasize that it was Spanish gunpowder and the fact that they were seen as gods that toppled the Aztecs. Contemporary explanations emphasize that the Spanish had hundreds of thousands of native allies, Mayan speaking people happy to have an ally against the Aztecs. Disease also played a disproportionately large role in the demise of the Aztecs. So, in the area that would become the United States of America, an early people the Spanish came into contact with were part of a broad cultural region that we today call the Mound Builders or the Cahokia and Hopewell civilizations. So these ancestors of those who speak modern day Algonquin languages range from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains and even into parts of western New York. From excavating these sites, it's obvious that they had trade relations with people all the way to the Pacific Ocean and importantly with Mesoamerica. The structure of their ceremonial mounds sometimes seems to almost mimic the stone architecture of Mesoamerica. So while early Spanish explorers saw cities with thousands of people, these cultures, these people, literally died out by the time of widespread English and French contact. So farther to the west, Puebloan Indians, uh, including those speaking Uto-Aztecan and Athabascan languages, had common cultural practices as far north as Utah and Nevada, and as far south as the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. So these people were decimated by European diseases uh, in the 1500s, and in the last 500 years before the Spanish arrived in the New World, they had expanded from Alaska all the way to Mexico. I worked on archaeological excavations of Uto-Aztecan peoples in southern Utah in 2003 and 2004, and I managed the flotation lab, so basically going through sample sediments to try and determine what kinds of pollens were present in different periods of their history. Um, anyways, we found really interesting things on these projects. So, first of all, in the 1300s, the population density of southern Utah was about 10 times what it is today. When things were going well, there was evidence that there was lots of hunted meat like wild sheep, deer, buffalo, even dogs in their bone piles, which eating small dogs that was common among the Aztecs as well. The climate 700 years ago was less desert-like than it is today, but still dry. Their main subsistence, though, didn't come from hunting. It came from corn, which they grew in valleys during the summertime where, they also hunted, fished, and gathered wild foods like sage, berries, juniper, and cactus. In the wintertime, they would move to cliff tops, where they stored their corn in granaries that were extremely difficult to get to on the sides of cliffs. In both their summer and winter residences, they would build small cities. They made pottery, artwork, toys, a stylized form of rock art. They wove wool and juniper bark, made ropes and nets, and lived fairly good lives. By the end of the 1300s, the Navajo moved into the area where we were studying, and Anasazi and Fremont people moved farther to the south. Some, like the Fremont, would essentially become the Hopi. Others, like the Anasazi, became the Puebloans, different Puebloan groups. Um, and Some among them likely joined with the Aztecs. So there's an archaeological site from the late 1300s where 70 skeletons have been reconstructed showing evidence of butchering and cooking human skeletons, so cannibalism. So clearly, by the late 1300s, there was enormous stress in this region of the world. So by the early 1400s, many of their dwellings were located in the same cliff sides where they formerly put only their grain. So you see evidence of extreme stress a century before the Spanish came. So the Navajo adopted many of the cultural practices of the Puebloans, but maintained a distinct language and culture. They are the largest Native American tribe in the United States today, with around 400,000 people. There are quite a few Navajo who, unlike other tribes in the US, actually still speak Navajo as their first language. Navajo people are renowned for their pottery and weaving, and since Spanish contact, for their shepherding skills. Today, most Navajo make their livings from tourism, sheep, or mining and oil drilling, and of course, the same diversified economies that are everywhere. So before contact with the Spanish, they knew how to weave from wool, but it was wool taken from hunted sheep, not farm sheep. So Navajo wool rugs today from their massive herds sell for thousands of dollars apiece. Okay, so farther south, another civilization, and we'll read a little bit more about them later, that controlled vast amounts of territory and had trade relations all over South and Central America, were the Inca. Sometime in the 1200s, the Inca began to organize cities and trade routes between the Andean Mountains and the Pacific Ocean in Peru. Between 1438 and 1533, they rapidly expanded their political control, covering much of the Andean mountain range. In 1438, they built their capital in Cusco, which in the Quechua tradition, the dominant native language in Peru, spoken almost as frequently in that country as Spanish, is the navel of the universe. It's a beautiful city built in the mountaintops of the Andes for defensive and cosmic purposes. They didn't have a written language, but in order to administer their large empire, they developed an algorithmic system of record keeping that uses the same principles as modern day computers, quipu. with with knots tied into them that, when arranged and interpreted by an accountant, could tell important financial and economic information. They were also masters of surviving in high altitudes. They learned to grow things like potatoes and quinoa, which could survive cold weather and grow well in otherwise poor soil. So in 1527, though, Francisco Pizarro came down from Mexico and made contact with the Inca, having heard of their vast riches. He was right. Incans excelled at metalworking, and Pizarro was able to gather roomfuls of gold that he smelted into coins, loaded onto ships, and sent back to Spain. In 1531, Pizarro came back to Peru and was able to conquer them with only 127 Spanish troops and about 10,000 native allies. Part of the reason it was so easy is that Spaniards had advanced fighting skills learned during the centuries of fighting against Islamic powers in Spain, but disease had also ravaged the Incan Empire, and the Spanish very skillfully played against inter-palace politics, uh, working specifically with those who wanted to betray the Inca, so the Inca leader, called the Inca. So they held on under Pizarro's control until the 1570s, when the Incan Empire was fully absorbed into the Spanish colony of Peru. All right, as always, I hope you enjoy some bonus questions. Let me get to these for you. All right, and please let me know if you have any questions. And again, I apologize that this was late getting up this week.